Hi, Ryan Reynolds here for Mint Mobile. Are you looking for a beach read this summer? May I suggest your big wireless bill? It's got suspense, mystery, a slightly flat, emotional arc, and a shocking twist where you realize you've been overpaying the entire time. Fortunately, though, Mint's story is better. Every plan, $15 a month. Even unlimited. That's it. Happy ending, zero tears. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3 months, $90 for 6 months, or $180 for 12-month plan required. $15 per month equivalent. Taxes and fees extra. Initial plan term only. Greater than 50 gigabytes may slow when network is busy. See terms.
Today, I'm excited to be talking to the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author Eric Moskowitz about his gripping new book, The Hardest, Longest Race: Henry Ford and the Cross-Country Contest That Changed America. In the summer of 1909, a handful of daring drivers set out on an insane 4,106-mile journey from New York City to Seattle, the first true coast-to-coast automobile race in U.S. history. They battled mud, bogs, mountains, mechanical disasters, sabotage, and roads that barely existed, all to prove the future of the automobile. At the center of it all was Henry Ford and his unlikely little Model T, in a story packed with ambition, grit, controversy, and cheating that helped launch the modern auto age. I hope you guys enjoyed today's episode. A quick word from our sponsors.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
Eric, welcome to the show.
Oh, what a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me, Peter.
Awesome. So we're just going to continue the conversation we were having before I click record, but let's talk about the story itself for this book, because I've never heard of this. How did you hear about this? Like, when did this start? What was the impetus for this book?
Sure. I mean, it's a great question. So I was a newspaper reporter for almost 20 years, 12 of them at the Boston Globe. And when you're a reporter, you're looking for stories anywhere you can find them. And I was never the kind of reporter who was good at like dreaming up like a thematic idea or a big picture idea from my desk. I would just go out and stumble upon things. And this one kind of came to me as a result of that. Like I had written as a sort of suburban reporter at the Globe when I first got there. I wrote a budget crisis in the town of Stoneham, a suburb of 20,000 people north of Boston. So severe they were going to cut high school sports. You know, it's the kind of thing you like parachute in, you write a couple of stories, then you're done and you move on to something else. And I wound up on a listserv of people who got active in the town. And, you know, I read it for a little while, but it was like not relevant to what I was working on after that. I moved on to other beats. And like a year and a half later, I got the weekly local government agenda for that town over this listserv that I had like never unsubscribed to. And, you know, I had not read the previous 50 select board agendas for the town of Stoneham, Mass. And for whatever reason, like that day, it just hit me like, I'll open this email. Like maybe they're arguing about something in this town, or maybe there is something that speaks to, I don't know, some zoning issue or some regional trend where if you don't live in this one town north of Boston, but if you live in Boston or you live west of Boston, or you live south of Boston in the readership, like it'll speak to you. And so I opened it and I'm skimming it and it's just like local government standard fare. And then I get to the end and there's like, and it was a proclamation or a commendation honoring the forgotten Shawmut Motor Company, the pride of Stoneham, and the rightful winner of the like 1909 Ocean to Ocean race for the Guggenheim Trophy, which, by the way, Ford cheated to win to promote.
Yeah.
And I was like, what? You know, like, I mean, if you read that and you're a reporter and like all the like bells and whistles and lights are not going off, like you're in the wrong line of work. So I was like, wait, they built cars in Boston. They built cars in this like one random town. This car won a cross-country race I'd never heard of, and Ford was involved and cheated. I was like, I need to write about this. So I wrote a 1,500-word feature, you know, like a good-sized newspaper feature at the time for the 100th anniversary, because Model T enthusiasts were retracing the route. So this is a race that went from New York City to Seattle, where they're holding a World's Fair in 1909. And so they were retracing the route, and they had done that in the past on different anniversaries. But for the first time, they kind of extended an olive branch to this small town outside Boston that had built this car that was the deserving winner, but had been eclipsed by, you know, Ford's sort of sharp elbows and subterfuge. And so wrote a story, and it was back then I was writing like 100 stories a year, but that was one that stayed with me. I thought that if I ever have time to turn this into a book, or if I had the wherewithal to do like a narrative podcast, whatever, like this could be something more. And it wasn't until 2016 I sat down with an agent. By then I had a few other ideas. She was like, "What do you got?" I told her my first three ideas. She was like, "No, no, no." I was like, "Oh my God, I'm wasting this woman's time." And then she was like, "Well, do you have anything else?" And I was like, "Well, I wrote this story about a cross-country auto race that Ford cheated to win in 1909 to promote the Model T." And she was like, "That's a book. That's a book." So that is how I'm here talking to you today. I mean,
I love that. You're like out the door. Well, I also.
right, exactly. It's a fourth idea by then. Uh, yeah.
That's awesome, and I love how Ford, like, doesn't really mention in its history going forward decades later that it was stripped, like, their winning was stripped away. They're still like, FYI, we won this race."
Yeah, and I have, I mean, it's like, I mean, in '59 on the 50th anniversary, they like really promoted the heck out of it, and then they felt like enough time had elapsed that like we could talk about this again, and we can get into like what happened, but um, and somebody in Stoneham, like the son of the Shawmut driver, spoke up and was like, guys, and they wrote him a letter. They're like, "You must be really proud of your dad's accomplishments, but like, who can really say like this was, there was a lot of controversy. What is clear for sure is that like a Ford crossed the finish first, and that is true, right? Like,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
the sort of global publicity out of it. But I will say that like they had the right car for the moment, right? There had been other lightweight affordable cars before the Model T. What is different about the Model T, it is the first lightweight affordable car that is also durable. Like that is the magic addition. I mean, it's like there were other like MP3 players before the iPad, right? iPod, right? It's like what is it about this thing that like there are other smartphones before the iPhone? Like what is it about this thing that like awakens consumers to this category? And Ford knew that he had something different about the Model T because he had hit on this like special steel alloy that would enable him to build a strong car at a lightweight. But consumers don't know that like until they see the performance in the race. And so, I will give them, obviously have to credit them for like being visionaries, having a network to propel them to the finish. But like nonetheless, like they cheated, right? So whether that's the story of like, American capitalism or it's unique to this race, like it does eclipse like this sort of underdog entry from Boston.
Yeah, I keep on thinking of, like, Edmund Burke, the theory of, like, you take advantage of all your opportunities, father of conservative thought. It's like, well, they cheated, but, at the end of the day, they won. So
Right, and they were certainly not the only car company that cheated in a race in the early 1900s, right? It's just that they happen to be the one um, that like has this car that takes off and changes the world, right? Like at
yeah.
this moment, no one knows they're going to make 15 million Model Ts, and that like we'll all be living in this world.
And we're not gonna talk about exactly how they cheated. You should read the book, everyone. So, but let's kind of try to paint this picture, right? Paint a picture for me. It's 1909. Why are we having this race? And what does the American automotive landscape look like?
It's so things have changed very quickly. So I would say that the automobile landscape in 1909 looked like the personal computing landscape in the late 70s, which is, I mean, there's very similar number, like about 1 in 500 people owned a personal computer then, about 1 in 500 people own an automobile. That is up rapidly from like 1 in 10,000 at the turn of the century. I mean, very quickly, you have gone from the car being like the devilish plaything of the gilded class, people cursing it, farmers in particular, to it being like I would say like a coveted luxury item. And increasingly, there are cars available for middle class consumers, but like, meaning like there are many cars you could buy for 3, 4, 5,000 and more, and it's like a 30x inflation. So, that would be like somebody paying 150 grand. But there are also a lot of cars you can buy for 1,000, for 900, for $800, which like, a middle class family could buy. But then if you buy a car like that, that it's going to fall apart on you. It's not going to take you more than around town, that it's going to be sort of buyer beware. You're going to have to invest in all kinds of other stuff. So these people are waiting on the sidelines. They feel like technology is improving. Do I hold off until, I mean, they're going to car shows, they're reading car magazines, but do I buy a car in 1910? Do I wait until 1911? Do I wait until 1912? And that's where Ford feels like he has this right car for the moment. And so like this race hits at a really interesting time. And it's not the first long distance race. I mean, they like to call it the first cross country auto race in America. Even that is a bit of an asterisk. You had a 1905 cross-country race involving 2 Oldsmobiles, but that was not open to anyone. Then you have this, like, wild race in 1907 from, Beijing to Paris, and that's really just to show that, like, the automobile could go great distances. And then in '08, you have a absolutely bonkers race westward from New York to Paris. I mean, they thought cars were gonna drive across the Bering Strait. That obviously doesn't happen. Cars spend a lot of time on railroads. They spend time and kind of cheating. They spend time on ships. Like, that is not a really sort of competitive, like, sporting venture, but it's a sensation in terms of publicity. So in 1909, with that as a backdrop, you have a World's Fair in Seattle. The people promoting the World's Fair know they're gonna have a harder time, like, getting tourists from New York, from Boston, from Washington, DC, from Cleveland, from St. Louis, to get on a train and go cross country than you would have had to get them to go to World's Fairs, on the Eastern Seaboard or in the Midwest. And so they need something sensational that will get publicity. And they realize, like, if we have a cross country auto race, this is going to generate press day after day after day. And they need a name and they need money. And, like, into this environment walks 23, almost 24-year-old Robert Guggenheim. And he's basically a mark. I mean, obviously people know the Guggenheim name. And this is like, you have a typical situation where you have like a sort of patriarch who builds up the family. Then you have the next generation sons who are very enterprising. By the third generation, they don't need to work as hard. The family wealth is like 100 million. Country has like an insatiable hunger for copper, for wiring, for telegraph and telephones. They're mining and smelting. And Robert Guggenheim, as the first grandson of this generation, like, the mantle is his, and he doesn't want it. I mean, he says, every family of means supports at least one gentleman in leisure, and I elect to assume that position in mine. And, like, by his early 20s, his dad is kind of sick of him. So he, like, punts him across country to Seattle, ostensibly to, like, look after a nearby smelter, but mainly to, like, get out of the way in New York. And when he arrives, he, like, walks in and is, like, trying to impress people as this, like, Manhattan swell. And they're like, that's the guy. And they whisper in his ear, and suddenly it's his idea. And he puts up all the money. And now you have, like, the Guggenheim name, like, gets headlines, and you have this cross country race.
Yeah, and it's interesting too when you start thinking about. I mean, I don't remember the exact number. It was like 250 something automakers, right? Like, that's a thing that people miss when they think of how many car companies existed.
Well, yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, that's one of the things that, like, absolutely astonished me when I first started looking into this. First of all, like, we know, like, we have the big three today, right? And, like, what's the heart of the American auto industry and has been for generations is the Midwest. But I had no idea that, like, New York and New England were as important to the early days of the automobile as Michigan and Ohio. And that, like, particularly in the sort of dawn of the auto industry, when it was really still the domain of, like, tinkerers and workshops and things like that. I mean, it makes sense. I just didn't know it, that it would flow out of, like, the same sort of what we might think of as, like, the innovation corridor of, like, the Connecticut River that, like, yielded so much American progress in the late 19th century. And by 1909, we know this figure 253 because it's kind of astonishing. The tariff on imported European cars is 45%. And the auto industry wanted to expand and extend these tariffs that were expiring. And so they did a lot of research, and they were lobbying Congress in late '08. And one of the things they found out was that there were 253 automakers. And, like, they basically sort into three categories. You have a few, Ford included, who are already building anywhere from, like, 1,000 to 10,000 cars a year, right? Like, by our standards today, that is nothing. But at the time then, that is staggering. Then you have, like, a few score companies that are building anywhere between, like, 100 and 1,000 cars a year. And then the rest, like 200 companies, are like, I would say they're building like zero.
A go-kart in their garage.
Yeah, well, exactly. And, they've, like, convinced a few investors that they have something going, and, like, maybe they don't have anything that ever comes to market. What's unique about the Shawmut car, which is the one that, like, it's ultimately crowned the winner 4 months after this race that nobody notices, is that they are a tiny company, but they're set apart because they have the backing of, like, rich Brahmins in Boston these are guys who have, like, owned a lot of cars already. And, they have a sort of, like, kind of Goldilocks mentality. They like this about this car, but it's not quite right. They like this about that car. They've imported a lot of cars from Europe, and they sort of, like, pull together and think, like, what if we invested a ton in R&D, tried to build the best possible car for ourselves And then if we succeed, like scale it into a business. And they are pretty obsessive about it. And so that kind of sets them apart from other small automakers that are really just sort of assembling parts. And they get some good press, and then catastrophe strikes. Friday the 13th in November of '08, the factory burns down. And they're right across the street from the fire station in Stoneham, but it's a volunteer fire department. And so they burn down, and they have only a couple of cars, and they're trying to like generate the publicity and the capital to start over. And they hear about this race, and it's like a Hail Mary play. Like, we will enter this race, and if we do well enough, if we possibly win, maybe we can save the business.
So a few things to unpack here, because I do want to kind of talk about some of these lesser known Acme, right, as well, like some of these lesser known
Yeah.
companies. But I also want to talk about the fact of what this race does for the roads and how perilous this entire race is. Like there are no highways, right?
Oh, right.
So let's touch upon the I guess before we get into the companies, let's talk about the race itself. Like, what are these people facing?
Yeah. So, today you want to drive from New York to Seattle, that's all interstate. It's like 2,850 miles. I don't, if you sort of set your mind to it, you could do it in like a couple of days, or you had like help. Back then, forget interstates. There's not even highways. I mean, they were talking. Guggenheim, he has a young uncle who's a senator in Colorado. President Taft. These guys believe in a coast to coast highway. And we should clarify when we talk about this like wild vision of a coast to coast highway in 1909, they don't mean anything that we would recognize as an interstate. They just mean this is a road that you could draw a line on a map from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and that if you were driving it, you would recognize it as a road the whole way. I mean, that was like revolutionary, because for most of the country, like there just aren't roads, right? You have, I would say, like roads fall into three categories. You have like roads in cities that are clearly paved. And then, you have a sort of burgeoning improvement in the bicycle boom in the like 1880s and 1890s, also around cities. And then you have like roads that bring farmers to market that are pretty rough. And then you have like old wagon trails that in many cases people are still taking. I mean, there's still people going west by covered wagon in 1909. I mean, there are not a lot of them, but like, people who can't afford to pack their belongings into a train are going west by wagon. And like, particularly in, Idaho, places like that, you are following the old Oregon Trail. Like, there's not really roads across the state. The way people are traveling is by railroad, right? Like anybody, like, you're a fool if you're trying to get around any other way. And in fact, you mentioned the Acme, and I'm struck by like how colorful the people were who were drawn to the automobile in this era. And Acme is a medium-sized company that, like, despite building a very good car, had been kind of treading water for a few years. And they have as their New York City dealer, they're in Reading, PA, but they have a New York City dealer named Auckland B. Cordner. And this guy, I mean, he was like a mining stock salesman. He just has a sort of like sensational knack for publicity. And he recognizes that like he can grab headlines if he puts an Acme limousine in service between two of the most famous hotels in the world, the Waldorf Astoria in New York City, and the Bellevue or the Bellevue Stratford in Philadelphia. And so he puts into play what the press dubs the millionaire's intercity express. And so like running on a loop every day, you can catch a ride from this one fancy hotel to the other. And like today, who cares, right? You get on a van, you get in an Uber, whatever, you drive yourself. But back then, like, you had to be nuts to drive between New York and Philadelphia. Like, good luck getting there in a couple of days. Like, people had given up on that. That was something you did by coach until the railroad had come out like 2 generations earlier. So nobody is like, you have like it, just this incredible network of railroad and streetcar, intercity streetcar. So no one, like, automobile is for recreation, right? And like, good luck if you're going like, like, you can't rely on it to go anywhere long distance unless you have abundant time and resources.
Yeah. Can you maybe talk about some of the characters, interesting characters, colorful characters that you kind of found throughout your research? You're like, oh, this is cool. Like, I'm curious about this person.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many. Like, it's kind of a miracle that I ever finished the book, given how many colorful characters you trip over when you start to research the automobile in 1909. I mean, that guy Cordner I mentioned, for example, he's in the book for like a couple sentences, right? And you can't stay with a story unless you have protagonists, characters to follow. And so, there are a lot of like interesting sort of colorful folks who come and go. But you really stick with the Shamak car and then there Ford enters 2 Model Ts in the race. And I got very lucky in the case of the Shamak car, that the mechanic on the car, a guy named Earl Chapin, was writing letters home to his wife, madly in love. He is missing their first wedding anniversary for this sort of risky adventure to try to save his job, and he's going to be gone for potentially up to 2 months. And so he wants her to know that he's thinking about her. And so he is, it's not like he can send her a text message or dash off an email or even like write with a ballpoint pen. Like, he is taking a fountain pen and writing either on stationery, or if he doesn't have the conditions and the time on stationery, writing a postcard. And like, first of all, God bless Earl Chapin for doing this in the first place. God bless his wife Anita for saving these letters, and then the family for holding on to it across the generations and moves. And you think about all the things, like when you're talking about the papers of someone who's not famous, like, it could be lost to flood or like fire, or somebody doesn't realize what they have, or they don't pay the rent on their storage unit, like what have you, that like I managed to track down Earl's grandson. He's a sculptor in the Hudson Valley. And it was like,
Ta-da!
I mean, yeah, I mean, it's like, I tracked down like a couple hundred people and they're all like, who, what now? But like, there were a couple people where I tracked them down and like, it was like they were waiting for this call their whole lives. And like that, I mean, it's such a gift as a researcher and a writer, because if you have letters, the bedrock of my understanding of this story is the newspaper coverage. But if you have letters from somebody who's on a car, I mean, that like, first of all, it gives you detail you can't get anywhere else, but it also like gives you a sense of who they are as people, like their interior feelings. And like, so that, I mean, I think that like the like Earl Chapin's experience, that's a kind of like maybe the emotional core of the book. Anybody who likes cars is going to enjoy this story. This is a race going cross country. I also give you a lot of glimpses of like America encountering the automobile at this moment in time.
Okay, some of that was funny.
Yeah, and so you asked about like who else I came across. I was worried my editor was going to cut all this away, but I tried to like shade in like bits and pieces that spoke to me as I was doing the research. And like, for example, like the race goes through Abilene, Kansas, right? I mean, it's good. So far, you talked about the route, like, and this is where like I didn't get to this before. The way they got across country back then is they go up from New York City. You can't go west from New York City because there's no way to go across the Hudson. They go up, all the way to Albany. Then they go west to the Great Lakes. Then they go to Chicago, down to St. Louis, across to Kansas City, across Kansas. It was sort of they were thinking like, there's no good way to get across the Midwest if it rains because of gumbo mud. And we can talk about what that means in a moment, but like maybe Kansas will be better than Iowa and Nebraska. Then they went into Colorado, and Denver was kind of like, has this great history as an early adopter of the automobile. So it was good to make an appearance there. And then they go up to Cheyenne, Wyoming, and then follow like the sort of southern edge of Wyoming into Idaho, across a bit of Oregon, and then go across Washington. Crossing the Cascades, it's like you wouldn't want to walk across it, let alone like try to drive it with an automobile in 1909. So that is that is the route. Now, coming back to Abilene, if people know history, they may know that like that is the home of the Eisenhowers. And like, where I was trying to shade in people, and if you don't mind me just like like looking at this in the book.
Yeah, of course.
I was like, Abilene, I was like, oh, that's where Dwight Eisenhower's from. And like, sure enough, I'm like looking at the coverage of the race in the Abilene newspaper, and like the same paper has like, a high school baseball result with like a box score or whatever, like with like Dwight and his brother, and like the week
That's awesome.
perhaps into a fence and like cut open his head. And so, but then there was like even better stuff. So, I said, the Wheaton cattle community of 4,000 was known less for the Eisenhower brothers. Decorated scholar athletes Dwight and Edgar had just graduated together from the local high school a few days before, than for America's youngest motorist, 6-year-old Bessie Colson. The apple-cheeked daughter of a local Buick dealer had been driving for over a year, a promotional stunt conceived by her father to demonstrate that people should not be intimidated by the training or skill needed to operate an automobile. So simple that even a child could do it, literally. When Bessie buzzed around Abilene with a car full of playmates, her father typically stood on the running board to monitor the proceedings. But when the little girl put on exhibitions at county fairs, she drove alone, tracing grooves around horse tracks largely by feel, unable to see much over the wheel. I mean, like, I have a newly 7-year-old as of last week. Like, never would I let him drive a car. But like, it speaks to like how new and unregulated this was at this time, and also the kind of like what seemed to us kind of bonkers ways that like people were experiencing the car. And, I don't know about you, like whenever I dig in the past, the two things that strike me the most are like, um, how little things have changed and how much things have changed. So like,
Absolutely.
that's like what makes my radar go off. And I was like, first, and then I was like, well, could this be real? Like, is this girl really 13, but they're like lying that she's 6 to get attention? Does she exist at all? And then, go to Ancestry and track down like vital records and find out, in fact, like she is 6, almost 7.
Yeah.
So, I was like, I didn't want to burden the story. You wanted to keep the race moving. And you really like, you get invested in the Ford car and the Shamet car. And it is the story of the race and the hijinks and the cheating. But like, as it passes through, like Montpelier, Idaho, there's a guy who like, 13 years earlier, he had chased after Butch Cassidy after a bank robbery on a bicycle, it doesn't succeed. Like Cassidy and his gang are taken off on horseback, but like 13 years later, he's like one of the leaders of this same town and he owns like the first Model T in town. I mean, it's just like super.
Yeah. I
So
love that.
I tried to like fold in those wherever I could.
Yeah, and that's the thing about when you do research is, first of all, it's so much, I don't want to say easier because it is easier in many ways, but harder in others. When you're younger and your teacher tells you have to write a 5-page paper and you're like, oh, how am I going to do that? And then when you become a journalist and you're a writer, they're like, do this in 2,000 words. And you're like, I can't do this in 2,000. I need 5,000. That's the opposite problem. But as you said, that's kind of why this podcast exists, is because as I do research for my books, I'm like, this is cool. So I'm glad you were able to keep a lot of these things. For me, it was funny. It was like a chuckle as you're reading it. But, this idea of like, you come across so many cool stories, you're like, ah, but like, you got to stay focused. You got to stay focused. But there's so much cool stuff there.
Yeah, I mean, some of the stuff I got rid of. Some of the stuff I had to like, I was able to like offload but save in the notes, the research notes. But more of it than I expected, I was able to keep. And like, God bless my editor, Charlie Spicer, because I thought that he was gonna think like, um, gotta stick to the race. And I don't mean these are long digressions, but like that, just like I think he felt too that like giving you a taste of this all along the way, like shows you what America was like in 1909. And that,
Absolutely. And the beauty of it too, because you're talking about reading in the newspapers and going on ancestry.com, is that, I mean, newspapers.com is invaluable to me.
yeah,
Ancestry is invaluable to me. Like, these are things that National Archives, what is it? Internet Archive.
yeah.
These books that have never, haven't been published.
Which right,
I
like
started, I donate money now. I'm like, I get the thing. I'm like, here you go, take my money. Like, without you, where would I be? Like, just go. I think we're lucky in that sense. I can't imagine doing research and writing a book 50 years ago.
yeah. I mean, and that's
Right.
where like, I still did spend some time on microfilm. And it's funny you mentioned newspapers.com, like, and we can, it's kind of you to like not want to unpack all the cheating because people hopefully they'll buy the book and want to read it.
Yeah.
Give you a taste. Like, one of the things that happens, so there's 2 Fords in the race. The only way you can get across Missouri is to cross the Missouri River. You did it at that time in the city of Glasgow, kind of an old Missouri River trading post. And the only way to do it was to like get aboard a ferry there. And I don't mean like a ferry that will take you to Martha's Vineyard. Like, this is like a little raft where you could fit like 1 or 2 cars, a couple of people surrounded by planking so you don't fall into the river. And then there's like a little motor and it takes you across. And the 2 Fords get there and they cross the Missouri River. And then the Shamet and the Acme come up right behind. And they would have been with them, except for the fact that they don't have the network of guides that Ford has. So they've both kind of gotten lost a little bit that day. But they pull up, not long after the Fords have crossed. And they are on the east bank of the Missouri River, expecting this ferry on the west bank to come back and pick them up and take them across. And the ferry has just like tied up and mysteriously is like done for the day. And like Henry Ford had been there for this. Like, let's be clear, Henry Ford is not driving the car, right? He has crews to do this, but he is like popping up in places throughout the route. And he is here at Glasgow, Missouri. And like, it turns out that like the ferry operator was just like, oh yeah, propeller's broken. And like, maybe, I mean, like there's, I don't know, 1 in a million. What are the odds that like you take the 2 Fords in the race across and then suddenly you break down? But it kind of like defies belief. Like I would say that like most people imagine that like some money had to have changed hands. And so you had to get creative. Like, how do you get across? The Shamet ends up, ultimately backing up and driving across this like terrifying, towering railroad bridge, the Chicago and Alton Railroad, where you can like, see through the ties, like down the river below, you like shake the wheel, get bumped, the car's going off the edge, they're all going to die. So they drive across this. They actually don't end up losing that much time, but it's like, the fact that like this seeming smokescreen or obstacle has like been thrown up in their path, like that happens in a number of places. And I wanted to gather up all the information I could, and so I'm looking for newspaper coverage. And as you know, like you find old newspapers and like sometimes it aligns, sometimes it leaves gaps, sometimes it conflicts. And like I felt like I need to get as close to it as possible. And then at the time that I was looking, the nearest digitized coverage was like, some few counties away. And so I was, through the, Missouri Resource, State Historical Society, I think, was able to get a number of reels of microfilm by interlibrary loan for Armstrong, which is like the next town, and then Glasgow itself. So, you spend like all day long, like turning the microfilm, like reading page by page, like you're straining your eyes, making copies. And like, I did that and like, eureka, like I found like great coverage in the Glasgow papers and even wound up with back and forward and like felt so proud of myself. Most of what I was finding was digitized, but like felt so proud of myself of that investment of time and money to pay for that. And like 3 weeks later, 3 months later, whatever it was, I was like looking for something else. And like by then the Glasgow paper had been digitized. Right. And like, it's like, and suddenly I could just like plug in a search term and I'm like finding all kinds of additional things. So there's just like
Dang
so
it.
much has been unlocked, like through
Yeah.
all the digitization of materials.
I was, yeah, but some things are still, some things are, it's a bummer that it was so close to it. Like,
Yeah,
I just got back from South Dakota. I was in South Dakota last week doing research. And I needed these particular archives, and they were at the South Dakota State University, and it was the only place that had exactly what I wanted, and I'm like, I'm in Jersey. So
Yeah.
it's like, okay, there's no direct flights to, Brookings, South Dakota.
Yeah.
So I'm like, okay, how much is this going to cost? And, just flying cost me $1,200.
Oh, yeah.
I'm like, and my wife's like, we could just fly to Europe for that. I'm like,
Right.
well, no, but I have to go to South Dakota. You don't understand, like, and then you get there and the people, I love, I love the people that do this, the archivists. They're so nice and sweet, and they help out so much. But, I fly in and I'm there for a day. It's like, and I sit through this stuff. Well, the beauty thing is, you could take pictures of everything and scan everything.
Yeah.
So you're there for a day or 2 days, but that's like 3 weeks when you get home from unpacking
Well,
it.
first of all, yeah, however much time it takes to unpack, but you're also doing the work there that you could have, that like ages ago would have taken someone weeks to do in that.
Yeah,
I'll take it
probably.
with my hand, like, but you also form relationships with the archivist, and then you can ask some questions by email and they'll help. In this case, I spent a lot of time on 2 trips to the Henry Ford Museum, the Benson Ford Research Center, and like took, I think like 4,000 photos of like, I don't know what I'm gonna need later, but like snapshot, archival boxes, and then unpack it later. In the case of like there were Colorado newspapers that aren't digitized and don't circulate on microfilm. So like, was able through History Colorado to hire a researcher to look through that there. But you always, I mean, as you know, like if you're a researcher, like you want to do the work yourself because you end up coming
fun.
across something that like will spark your imagination or speak to you that you weren't expecting to find.
So did you have like a big aha moment when you were like, ooh, you started like geeking out as like a history, nerd versus just an author historian?
I found a few moments like that. And one of my favorite was like, so as I'm looking through the materials at the Benson Ford Research Center, they had a lot that had been gathered in '59 for the 50th anniversary. And, by then Ford is obviously this massive company. And so they wanted to selectively tell the story of the race while traveling across country with a museum exhibit on wheels and a Model T, a Model K, Model A, all this stuff, and tell the past, present, and future of Ford and the American road. And so they were reaching out to newspapers and historical societies across the country in '59, asking them, can you send us clippings if you have them, if you possibly have photos, if is anyone alive who remembers this race coming through? And they gathered a lot. And then they used it selectively to tell the story that was in their interest in '59. But everything that they gathered was like in archival boxes. So that was a starting point for me. And they had also created a 3-ring binder of like 8x10 glossy images of photos that they had amassed in '59, taken in '09. And most of these were photos, as you might imagine, taken by like news services in the big cities, New York, the finish line in Seattle. There were some good photos taken around Cleveland. And then what we would think of as like vernacular snapshots are like few and far between, but some of them have like surfaced in 59 and are included in this. And there are like astonishing photos of the race in Goodland, Kansas. And this is a small town in western Kansas, close to the Colorado border. And, like, I mean, it looks like an old West sort of kind of street front, and the street is all mud, and the cars have come in, they're sort of unrecognizable. And there's like a series of snapshots. And it's just like, I was like transfixed by these. And these had been blown up to 8x10. But I knew enough from being a postcard collector and having written about postcards that these were clearly originally taken as postcard photographs and had later been blown up. And so that made me that made me realize that there must be more photos of this race that people have been holding on to that they don't even know about, or that have circulated that like have a sort of escaped notice in the years since. So I started entering like different eBay search terms. I went to a site called WorthPoint, which archives like decades of online auction data. Cause if you search eBay, you can only go back a few months. And I found on WorthPoint that in fact, actually, sometimes photos then, particularly postcard photos, the photographer would scratch at the bottom, like of the negative, what was happening, and then make and sell postcards at like, the local stationery store or something. And sure enough, like I would say like every other year, a new photo, or every 3 years, a new photo has surfaced from this race. And so I was able to find some that way that like had been seen before. I also reached out to like many, because things are online, like reached out to different local historical societies. And, Rock Springs, Wyoming, there was a great photo that like was not no one who knows the race was sort of aware of. But like most incredibly with eBay, like, I had anyone who's like tried to bid on things like, first of all, one of the search terms was Shawmut. And anyone who knows Boston history knows like there are a million things called Shawmut. That is like the sort of anglicized name of the original peninsula, the Mishomic Peninsula that the Massachusetts people had named that becomes Boston. And so like there's businesses named Shawmut, there's places named Shawmut, whatever. Like, so you're searching for Shawmut on eBay, and there's just like so much noise. And I ended up just like tuning it out eventually. And like, sure enough, one day I checked back in, and there is this like stunning photo of the Shawmut car as a postcard driving through Twin Falls, Idaho in the race. Like you can see the faces of the crew.
Oh,
You can
nice.
see like, there's like a banner that says like ball game today. You can see like a horse and buggy going the other way. I mean, it's just like, there's so much rich detail. And yeah, anyone who studies a photograph, like this is something I've gotten from Eric Larson. Like, you study like an archaeologist, you comb over it, like in quadrants, you're like going through like detail by detail. This photo is so good. And I look, and it had sold like the day before for like $23. And I was like, oh, it's like a dagger to the heart. And like, the saga of like how I went to like try to track down the buyer, the seller, eBay is like, eBay does not want to facilitate conversations unless we're actually,
Yeah, they don't. No, yeah.
like, where the number of steps that eventually led, ultimately, I was able to get a copy of that card and found like the world's leading expert on like Idaho in 1909. I mean, all as a result of like this missed auction. And it was just like,
That's awesome.
yeah,
You gotta love this.
yeah.
So I guess my last question is, if you zoom out, right, and take like a bird's eye view, how does that race kind of transform the nation going forward? Like the bigger impact of it.
I think that that it does a few things. I mean, number one, I mean, it like helps put the Model T on this sort of glide path to success. And there's no way to know, like without this race, does the Model T sort of succeed? And there's some people would say that like the Model T would have taken off in spite of it. But I really feel like this is an overlooked, very important overlooked ingredient in the Model T's rise, particularly because both Ford and then local dealers, even after they get caught cheating, in a way that is now clear to us because of digitization, we're advertising day after day, week after week. You too can own the car that won the New York to Seattle race, the hardest, longest race ever run, that defeated cars weighing several times as much, more powerful, costing several times as much. Like you can own this car. I mean, this is the template for the car commercials of the future. Like, look at this little car. It crossed mountain ranges, deserts, mud bogs, canyons. Like you won't need to try this at home, but in case you do, you can have this car and you can have it for just $850. And like, that is sensational. And like, and I feel like this race helps propel the Model T. So that is one thing. And then the Model T, like, many sort of dominoes fall into place. Like, it goes on to sell 15 million cars. Henry Ford becomes as famous as any American who's ever lived. This is a moment where like Henry Ford is not yet that famous. Like he is still mistaken in the press sometimes as Harry Ford, J.C. Ford. It's like kind of stunning to me. And then it's also, one of a few sort of cross-country voyages at this time that help shine a spotlight for the country on the fact that like the road system was like atrocious, right? Like, and that for the first time, maybe state governments should start to invest, and perhaps even the federal government. And so it really, I think, is an inflection point for the country as this sort of automobile is moving through its adolescence and is proving that it's here to stay, and the country's about to come along with it.
Eric, thank you so much for a great interview. This is such a great story. I can't recommend the book more. Hey, thank you for taking the time.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Some people use ChatGPT to answer questions. Others use it to get real work done. With ChatGPT Work, you bring the goal, plus real inputs like briefs, notes, files, feedback, data, and project plans. It can help turn them into an analysis, tracker, deck outline, prototype, or workflow you can review and keep shaping. You stay in control, giving direction and choosing the final output. Put ChatGPT to work on your most ambitious ideas and projects. Get started at chatgpt.com by selecting Work Mode. Available on Plus and Pro plans.